So, thank you so much for coming along to this session. And I'd like to start with a little bit of inspiration and motivation. So we'll look at some quotes, shall we? So this first one is from Coco Chanel. The most courageous act is still to think for yourself aloud. And isn't that the case? How often do we censor ourselves before we speak up? Now this one from Madame Curie herself. Have no fear of perfection. You will never reach it. So what is there to lose? If we're not going to be perfect, let's just go for it, speak up and have a go. And finally, a quote from someone not quite as famous as the last two, and that's to experiment to your heart's content. Because public speaking up in groups, in meetings, etc., it's not an exact science. We just have to try and go for it, and with time and with practice, we will improve. So what I want to do today is to give you some strategies to use in public speaking. You can use them during meetings, you can use them in job interviews, social settings, you can use them in a variety of situations. And I wanted to make this session interactive, even though we're in this huge room, because I feel that with speaking and with communication, if we don't get to actually try it, it's very hard for it to stick. So I will be asking you to connect with the person next to you, do a little bit of chatting with them, and I hope that's going to be okay. Does that sound all right? Yes. Excellent. So what I want to talk about first is who am I? So Elka's just given me a lovely introduction, and as she said, I'm a speaker, I'm an author, I'm also a singer, and here's a picture of me singing on a cruise ship of all places a few years ago, and I'm a huge, massive introvert. I like nothing more than hiding away in a darkened room, reading a book, and not necessarily interacting with people. And I worked in IT and management consultancy a while ago, and I was fine in the background, but when I was promoted into a more senior role where I was client-facing, I found that I really, really struggled. To the extent where in meetings, I wouldn't say a word. There was so much internal dialogue going on. Don't say the wrong thing. What will they think if you say this? What will they think if you say that? That in the end, I didn't speak up. And after 6 months in that role, when I was called into my boss's office, I was told that I was being let go. Now, as someone who had always been very conscientious, worked very hard, that was a real shocker to me. I felt frustrated, upset. I didn't really know how I could solve this problem. But years later, I started doing some personal development work. I practiced self-acceptance, and I learned the power of using frameworks to speak, which is what I use regularly with my clients when I'm out training at corporates. And frameworks can be brilliant both for introverts and for extroverts. Because if you're the sort of person that tends to overshare and you say too much, frameworks are brilliant at reining you in. And if you're the sort of person who tends to undershare, frameworks are excellent at making sure that you say all that there is to say. Because quite often it's not even the what we say that's important, it's the how we say it. How we hold ourselves, how we defend our opinion. That's where the respect often comes from. So what I want to do today is give you some frameworks you can use for concise communication, also for dealing with difficult questions, and also a couple of tips along the way for delivering your information with poise and with confidence. It's an interactive session, as I've said, and I will give you the opportunity to have a summary sheet on this, and I'll give you some more frameworks on that sheet too. So about partway through, I'll let you know how you can get those, and I'll ask you to get your phones out and sign up for those. Everyone okay with that so far? Perfect. All right, so here's how it's going to work. I'm going to give you 3 strategies to use today, and after I've introduced each strategy, I'm going to ask you to work in pairs and to answer a question to your partner. Now, depending on how much time we have, we may swap each time, and for each strategy, you'll both get a chance to try it out. Or it may be that we'll do it in turn, okay? But either way, I hope that everybody in this room in the next 20 minutes will speak, okay, not just me. What I'm going to do, it's a noisy room, there's lots of us here, so when it's time for you to swap, and you'll get 60 to 90 minutes each to speak, when it's time to swap, you will see me, ring my little bell, and put my hand up. Okay, so please, when you see my hand go up, if you could stop speaking, because otherwise it could be a horrible mess in here, and everyone just chatting and having conversations for the next 20 minutes. Okay. So the very first framework I want to give you is what we call the now, then, and how framework. And there's a speaker from the States called Lisa Nichols. Anyone heard of her? No one? So she's a fabulous speaker, and she calls this framework the dip, because there is a dip in the energy and a dip in the positivity, if you like, when you use this particular storyline. Now, this framework is excellent for storytelling, and it's excellent when you're describing some perhaps corporate turnaround, or perhaps a team that you worked with where there was a situation that wasn't so good, and then you managed to turn it around. Okay? Now, what we do in this framework, we start with the now, we start with where we are, and we start with a position of success. Then we go to a place where things weren't going quite so well. And the key with this framework is when you go to that then place, you need to hang there a bit. Okay? Don't brush over the then, that dark place, because it's the contrast between the now and the then that gets whoever's listening to you wanting to hear the how. How did you turn that around? What strategy did you use? How did you make that possible? But if you don't have a big enough gap between now and then no one really wants to know about the how. Okay? And that's where you get to demonstrate your expertise by how you turn things around. And if you may have noticed that when I told you my story just now, I used this very same framework. I told you about what I'm doing at the moment. I told you about a place where things weren't going quite so well for me. And then I told you about how I turned that around using self-acceptance, using personal development. Does that make sense? Yeah, brilliant. So what I'm going to do now it's your time to speak. And I want you to use the now, then, and how framework to describe a personal or a work-related challenge that you overcame. Now, what I'm going to do is put you in A's and B's. So in a second, is there someone speaking here? It's just a bit distracting. Oh, it's next door. It's like, oh, thank you. So what I'm going to do is put you in A's and B's. A can be the person with the longer hair of the two of you. Right? Scientifically determined. And when I call time, A will go first, and they will use that framework to describe a challenge that they overcame using the now, then, and how. And then when I call out to swap, B will use the same framework and do the same thing. Everyone clear? Brilliant. Off you go, A's. You have about 75 seconds. Wow, you are all so amazing. I love you. So tell me by show of hands, how many of you enjoyed using that framework for your stories? Quite a few of you. How many of you found it restrictive? Several of you. Okay. So then what you want to do, it depends on the story, of course. There are tons of different storytelling frameworks. There's context, action, result. There's the hero's journey. If you've got a very complex story to tell, you may want to use a more complex framework. But if you're in a situation where you've got to come up with a story quickly, and it's got to make an impact, this is a good one to use. The reason we say we use the now before the then, because some of you might say, well, why is this not chronological? Why don't we talk about then first and then go to now? if you start with the then, especially if it's in a meeting, people will quite often think, well, this is not relevant. Why are you going back to the past? But if you start with now, the present, the here and now, then you're more likely to grab people's attention before you talk about what happened in the past. Does that make sense? Yeah. Perfect. So let's move on to the next framework. And that's this one. It's called the PrEP framework. Any of you heard of this one before? No one. Excellent. I like that. So the way this works is it's an acronym. P stands for point, R the reason, E explanation, and finally P is your point. And this is an excellent framework to use when you are asked to justify your position on a particular topic or area. It's also great for explaining your reasoning. Why did you make that decision? And also very, very good for explaining your point of view. So how does it work? Well, let's take a question as an example. Let's say someone said to you, what's your opinion on banning motor vehicles in city centres so that we only have essential vehicles coming through? So you may say, well, my opinion on that is that I believe that vehicles should be banned. The reason being, I suffer from asthma. And during the summer, I have a terrible time getting to work, I can't breathe, etc. So all in all, I do feel that vehicles should be banned. So do you see how that's a very simple, very concise framework? And by summarising with your initial point, it gives a real air of completion. People know you've reiterated your point, they know you've come to an end. You can modify this. If you want to make a longer answer, you can give several reasons. I believe vehicles should be banned because there's lots of emissions, because it's dangerous on the road, whatever it may be. So you can actually extend these frameworks, and this one could be you give several reasons, or it could be you give several answers, give several explanations. Okay? But for today's purposes, we'll keep it nice and short: point, reason, explanation, and point. Okay? So what I want you to do now is this. In your pairs again, I'd like you to answer this question. What is the biggest, let's say, what's the skill that you're most proud of that you've developed at work? So that goes to B's first, and then we'll swap over. So B's, off you go. Brilliant. So how did that framework feel to you? Put your hands up if you enjoyed using it and you felt it was helpful, concise, kept you to the point. Okay. Hands up who weren't so keen on that framework. Okay, perhaps in the Q&A we'll hear why. One of the things about this framework is there can be a bit of a blend between the reason and the explanation, and people find it a little bit hard to actually separate the two. Don't worry too much about that. Some answers lend themselves to a separation. Some answers, it's okay if they've just come out as one. So that tends to be the main frustration with that particular framework. I can see a few heads nodding as well. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so we're going to do one more, and what we're going to look at is hedging. And I'm sure we've all watched Question Time or seen politicians where they've skirted around the answer and they haven't actually fully answered the question. And so in a minute, we're going to look at how to do that, because it can be useful. And the thing is, as women, we're often, I guess, under pressure to be, okay, we'll give you everything. We'll give you the whole answer. We're so earnest. We'll do whatever we can to answer that question fully. And sometimes that's to our disadvantage. So you've got to be selective about when you use hedging as a strategy. Maybe you don't use it in a job interview. Maybe you don't use it if you're in customer services, right? But nevertheless, it's useful to have as part of your toolbox. But before we go on to that, what I want to do is, because we don't have a great deal of time together today, there are lots of these different frameworks, and I would love to send you a summary sheet from today with some extra frameworks on it that you can use. So if you could please just grab your phones. The URL's here, sholakaye.com/silicon. If you just go in there, you can just add your name and your email address, and then I will send you the summary sheet for today. Also, in response to you being here, I'm actually going to give away one copy of my online public speaking training course to somebody who writes in for the summary notes. So I'll make sure that I'll send you that and let you know who you are. And then a couple of copies of my book, How to Be a Diva at Public Speaking, which was an Amazon.com bestseller. I'll give those out as well. Okay? I'll tell you about the course later, that's not interesting. But the most important thing is that you get a copy of the summary notes from today. Everyone got a copy of that down? Yeah? Okay, super. So let's move on to the last strategy. And that is the hedge. And it's a way to protect or to limit your exposure. And in this particular case, it's your exposure to a tough question that may put you on the spot, not show you in the best light, and therefore you want to deal with it rather than answer it directly. Now, we tend to hedge in response to a difficult question. So first, let's define what is a difficult question. So difficult questions can be long, complex, confusing. When you've got somebody who can't really articulate the question properly, or it's a very long question and you're a bit flummoxed as to how to answer. Difficult questions can also be inappropriate. They could be intimidating. Someone's trying to push you into a corner with a question. And instead of you having to answer it fully, you want to just slide away and escape to freedom. And finally, difficult questions can be phrased negatively. So if someone makes an assumption, why did it take you so long to get that report to me? That's phrased negatively, isn't it? So if you answer that question, keeping that assumption, it's like you're admitting to it taking a long time. So we can use different hedging strategies to deal with questions like this. Now, in terms of how to deal with your feeling in the moment when you're given a tough question, the important thing is to remember to relax and to breathe. Because if we breathe slowly, then we can't go into fight and flight and get really excited or upset, because that breathing will slow us down. Secondly, the key is to respond rather than to react. A response has an element of choice in it, whereas a reaction is just a blurting out of the answer. So if you're the kind of person who likes to answer immediately, your job might be to slow yourself down for a couple of seconds before you give your answer to the question. Other things are around staying grounded, making sure if you're standing in front of a group and it's Q&A, for example, making sure that you keep your feet apart so you've got a nice wide centre of gravity and then keep it nice and low. Also, another idea which you can use, which will slow you down when you're speaking, is to think of your toe as a metronome inside your shoe. So if you keep a steady tapping rhythm going on, it will stop you from speeding up too much, and it will keep the speed of your words regulated. So just a few little sort of performance and delivery tips there before we go on to try our hedging. So how do we deal with hedging? How do we deal with those difficult questions? There's a number of strategies we can use, and obviously because of time we can't look at all of them, but the first one is this. You can discuss the question, but don't answer. And this is one we see politicians do a lot, don't we? They talk around and around and around, but they never actually answer the question. And you hope that the questioner will be confused or just run out of steam, okay, and then you can move on. Another solution is to respond just to one aspect of the question. So choose the bit that you fancy answering and leave the rest behind. Okay? So let's try this now. And this is the question that we're all going to practice with, because this is quite an impudent question, isn't it? Right? And some people say, I've never been asked about my salary in my entire life. And others say that it's regular discussion over the water cooler, right? But a question could be, I heard you just changed jobs. What's your salary now? Okay. So I want you to think about how you would answer that question. And just flashing back, we looked at a couple of strategies. Discuss, but don't answer directly. Or respond to one aspect of the question. So I leave it to you to decide how to answer, but we're going to go back into our A's and B's again, and you each have 60 seconds to answer that question. So let's start with A's. Off you go. Okay, so I was running this workshop at an event for Harper's Bazaar a while ago, and the women there found it incredibly difficult to hedge because we're so not used to not answering the question, right? And quite often when we answer questions, we give them not only the answer, but we give them the kitchen sink, right? Okay? This happened and that happened, and the reason why was, etc. Okay? So one of the disciplines of using frameworks is just keeping to the framework. If people want to know more, let them ask. Your job is to answer crisply and concisely, and then to move on, right? If they want more information, let them ask. But don't put people in a position where you're giving them more and more and more and more. You get drained, they're drained, right? No one wins. So how did that feel for you to hedge? Put your hands up if it was a struggle because you're so used to being honest all the time and answering the question fully. Okay. And then hands up if you found that was a breeze, it's a stroll in the park. Okay, all right. Our next group of leaders are in the room, right? Okay, so we don't have time to do any more of this, unfortunately, because our time together is coming to an end. But what I want to urge you to do with these strategies and frameworks is to practice, okay? You can practice with kids, you can practice with your family, you can practice even on your own in front of a mirror, right? Or you can practice in groups with your friends. What you can even do is write out relevant questions for yourself and just close your eyes and point to one and say, okay, I'm going to answer that question next. Okay? These are all really valid strategies that you can use to get better at this, because it's that performance in meetings when you're on the spot, you're under pressure, that can often determine the next path in your career. Because I know for me, struggling at that was, I told you my story already, so I won't go into it again, but it really can help you to move forward. A last quote from Maya Angelou, which is, people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And if you answer a question in a really crisp and concise manner, they will feel that they are in safe hands. They'll feel that you've got it under control, okay, rather than a stumbling answer that goes on forever. So that's why these strategies are so important. So I don't know if there's any time for Q&A. There might be time for one question. Is there?
Yep.
Okay, great.
There is time for Q&A.
Perfect.
So what would you say to somebody that is about to make a speech somewhere? Maybe the manager said, hey, you're really good at this subject matter. Why don't you go and tell 300 people all about it? What would be
what
your
would
first
I suggest?
thing? Mm-hmm.
The first thing I would say is take the opportunity. Never say no, okay? Then I would suggest that you find the right framework for the information that you're going to deliver, because often the framework is the key. Then I would say it's about taking deep breaths, making sure you know what you want to say, keeping it concise, and then having a go, because it's all about experiment. And how will you get better at speaking to groups unless you try?
Thank you very much. Please put your hands together for Shola.
Thank you.